patrons! So here we are. This is the first of my pre-recorded video stories for this month, and we have the theme of the wee folk. So far this month we've looked at trolls in my zine, and we've looked at hidden folk, all sorts of different hidden folk and the origins of those hidden folk, and of course we've looked at fairies as well. We've also looked at changelings, so what happens when the fairy world interacts with the human world and in fact steals their children. So I'm going to stick with that theme of the fairy world interacting with the human world, but I'm going to take us from sort of Scotland and Ireland up to the Norse and Scandinavian countries, where I'll look a little bit further at the hidden folk this time. It is the fairies and the elves, whatever you want to call them, but this story is called Hilda, Queen of the Elves, or Queen of Elfland. The story is told in many different forms. It seems to have its origins in Iceland. The version that I'm telling you I first read in here, which is Nordic Tales, illustrated by the wonderful Ulla Thornell. I would definitely recommend this book. It's a lovely book. But there are many, many other versions that I have read since. This story is a slightly darker fairy story. It does have some themes within it which you might not want younger children listening to. So I would just suggest you have a little listen through to it first before you share it with the younger members of your family. So this is my version of the Queen of Elfland. Where this story took place, we can't actually be sure, because whilst this story has been handed down through many generations, shall we say the name of the people and the farm where it took place has been kept a secret. Perhaps to protect the innocent? Who knows? I'll let you decide. So, a long time ago, somewhere in Iceland, there was a farm. This farm was mainly a sheep farm. The farmer had many different herds of sheep to look after, and he would employ a herdsman to look after those sheep. He also had a housekeeper called Hilda. She kept the house very well. She was extremely efficient. The farmer never wanted for anything. His food was ready for him after a long day. His clothes were clean. His house was immaculate. This woman was a wonder. But she refused to marry him. She would only ever be his housekeeper. The farmer, however, had a slightly more pressing problem than what the neighbours thought about him living unmarried with another woman. It was the fact that each year he had to replace his herdsman. Why? Did he treat them badly? Were they not fed well? Were they not paid well? No, none of these things, for this was a lovely farm to work on. It was a very peaceful and successful place to work. But there is a tradition in Iceland where on Christmas Eve, the whole family goes to church. It's a very, very serious affair, and there is one person who is left behind to mind the house. In this family, that person was Hilda. Okay, you think so. What's that got to do with the herdsman? Well, here was the problem. The herdsman, he could never attend church either, because the sheep were kept in the pastures that are so far away from the farm that by the time he got back to the farm and then onto the church, well, the service would be over. And so he would come back to the house as well, and he would go to sleep. But in the morning, the herdsman was always found dead. But this farmer could make head nor tail of it. He could not understand why, and he had quizzed Hilda on several occasions, but of course, good, hard-working, innocent Hilda, she could not be held responsible for this, and, well, she always said she had no idea. She always heard the herdsman come home, but she never knew what happened after that. After all, she could not be responsible for another servant in the house. And so it was year after year that the farmer had to advertise and employ another herdsman. This did not sit well with his conscience, because he knew that every time he employed the herdsman, it was possible that they would not see the year out. So this year he had decided he would not employ another herdsman. He could not have that on his conscience again. He would let the sheep take their chances up in the fields and leave them. If the wolves took them, the wolves took them. Surely it was better than losing another life. And so it was a few weeks before Christmas Eve when the farmer heard a knock at the door and opened it to find a stout, strong young man asking for work, in particular the work of a herdsman. The farmer tried to turn him away. "I cannot in all conscience," he'd said, "give you a job as a herdsman. Have you not heard the rumours?" "Well, of course," said the young man. "I've heard those rumours, but they are just rumours and they don't scare me. If you have work, I need work. I need food in my belly and I need a roof over my head. I'll work as a herdsman because that is what I know." "Very well," said the farmer. And so he employed this young man, who knew very well what may happen to him, as the herdsman. The young man proved very good at his job. Not one sheep was lost in those weeks leading up to Christmas. And so it was that Christmas Eve came along. All the family, apart from Hilda that was, went out to church that evening. Hilda was left cleaning the house, sweeping the hearth, putting away any of the food that was left over from dinner for the next day, making sure all the beds were made for when the family returned, and ensuring that the shepherd's room and bed was also sorted out for him when he came home. It was late, very late, when the herdsman did return home, and as he crawled into bed underneath the prickly wool blanket and pulled it tight against the cold, it was then that he remembered those rumours and they came back to him. "You will not last the night," the voice said in his head. And so he thought, I wonder what does go on in this house on Christmas Eve night. And he made the decision not to sleep that night, simply to feign sleep, so that whatever may happen, he may be witness to it. It was as these thoughts were going round in his head and he pulled the blanket up to his chin, itching. He closed his eyes. Into the room he heard soft footsteps of a woman. And as he looked through his almost closed eyelids, he saw Hilda approaching the bed with a bridle of silver. She placed it over his head and pushed the bit into his mouth. It was as if he lost all of his own autonomy, his own ability to do anything that he wanted to do himself, and she dragged him from the bed. She placed a saddle on him, like a horse, and they were off. They rode like the wind through the night, across the heathland and through the forests, until they found the mountains. She pulled the reins over his head, leaving the bit in his mouth, and put a stone on the reins. And then she disappeared down into the valley, and the herdsman could not see where she had gone. He dearly wanted to. And of course, she thought he was asleep. But he was not, was he? He tried to spit the bit out of his mouth, but there was no way he could do that. Eventually he managed with his foot to move the stone from the reins, and he managed to get hold of the reins and pull the bridle off and the bit out of his mouth. And as soon as he managed to do that, he suddenly gained control of his limbs once more. He was free and he could follow Hilda. And so he did. He walked down into the valley, and there he could see her just ahead. Now he could see that she was wearing a glistening gown of green, and as she walked he could hear bells. This was no earthly woman. He followed her, and soon they reached a palace. He knew that if he was to go into the palace, he needed to stay hidden. And so he was careful to stay against the wall and in the curtains, where none of the fairies would see him. He found himself a place behind some plush velvet drapes, and he hid and he watched. He watched as Hilda walked into the middle of the room with all of the other fairies and elves and hidden folk cheering. Walked into the middle of the room and she sat on a throne. She was clearly their queen and they all knew her well. Soon a king joined her. They greeted each other lovingly. All of the fairies, they danced, they ate, they sang. This was truly a celebration. And then 3 small children entered the room and they ran up to Hilda. "Mother, mother," they cried. This was her children. They hugged, there were tears, but there was love. Soon the children were left to play with one of the Queen's rings. They threw it from one to another, it rolled across the floor, to and from, until eventually it rolled towards where the herdsman was hiding behind the curtain. He picked it up quickly and put it into his pocket. The children had no idea where it had gone, and they were being hurried by their mother because it was late and they must go to bed. It was late, and the Queen must now return to her human life. Well, there were many tears at this point. But there was also cheering as she left again, and "See you next year," said the fairies. "Farewell, our Queen," they said. And the herdsman, he hurried on ahead and got to the rock, thankfully, before Hilda, and he managed to put the bridle back on and he was waiting there for her. She got back into the saddle again and they rode again like the wind across the heath and through the forests and across the mountains until they reached the farm. Hilda put the herdsman back into bed and removed the bridle. Well, now he was indeed exhausted, and so he fell asleep. When he awoke in the morning, he wasn't quite sure whether what had happened was a dream or whether it was real, but when he felt in his pocket, he could feel the ring. He knew it was true. And when he strode into the farm kitchen, as alive as you or I, there were none more surprised than Hilda. The farmer, he was elated. "See," said the herdsman, "I did not die. I did have a very strange dream, though." "Oh, do tell us," said the farmer, eager to get to the bottom of what was going on in his house, but very pleased to not have to replace his herdsman. "Well, let me tell you," said the herdsman, and he described the journey, the bridle, how the bit felt in his mouth, the cold of the metal, and how hard his limbs had worked to try and free himself, and how he had discovered the Queen of Elfland and her king and her 3 children, and how he had watched as the fairies danced and celebrated her return. And then once more he had returned, Hilda riding him all the way home, till they had returned to the farmstead where Hilda had put him back to bed. The farmer looked at Hilda and said, "Is there any truth in this?" "Well, I cannot see how," said Hilda. "Does he have any proof?" "Well, I do." And the herdsman pulled out the ring, the beautiful solid gold fairy ring, and he handed it to Hilda. He said, "I believe this is yours, O Queen." Well, the tears that Hilda now cried were not tears of guilt, not tears of fright. They were tears of joy. For the curse that had been placed upon her was now lifted, and she told them of it. "My mother-in-law," she said, "when I married my king, she was so vexed, so jealous that I had taken her son, that she cursed me. She said that I would have no time with my husband and that I would only have 24 hours each year, and that would be Christmas Eve. The rest of the time I must return to the upper world and I must live with the humans. And the only way that I could get to the fairy world was if I bridled and saddled a human man, and that we travelled through the night, and that it exhausted him so much that his heart burst and that he would die. And I never wanted this to happen, but this was what the curse had said should happen. And there was nothing I could do about it. And I should not be punished for these deaths because it was not me that chose to do this. Well, the farmer thought about this, and that how many herdsmen he had lost. And yes, he was angry. And yes, he did feel that Hilda should be punished, but equally, he knew that the hidden folk, well, they were not somebody that you crossed. And so in some respects, the farmer felt lucky that this was all that had happened to his household during the time that Hilda had lived there. And instead, he just told her that she would need to leave and could never return to that farm. Well, of course, Hilda agreed. She wanted to go back to her king, and so she did. But before she left, she said to the herdsman, "For breaking this curse, I will reward you greatly." Well, the herdsman, he too was just happy to have got away with his life, and he went on to live a very happy life, and soon he had his own patch of land. He was able to farm. He had his own family and his own children and his own sheep to look after. He never ever forgot the Queen of Elfland. And he knew that he owed his prosperity and his success to Hilda, Queen of the Elves.
True Thomas lay on Huntley bank, a fairy he did spy with his eye, and there he saw a lady bride come riding down by the alden tree. Her shirt was o' the grass green silk, her mantle o' the velvet fine, and all about her horse's mane hung 50 silver bells and 9. Oh, they rode on and farther on, the steed was swifter than the wind, until they reached a desert wide, and living land was left behind.
I really like the sort of Nordic twist on the normal fairy stories, and this idea of somebody staying in the house on Christmas Eve to defend it from fairies and evil is something that runs through the Scandinavian stories, in particular those from Iceland. So you'll find a lot of stories where people often die on Christmas Eve. Perhaps this is because this is when the harsh winter was, and this sort of coincides with the hard times that they would have had as well. The uncertainty and the fact that they couldn't control the weather as well. So Queen of Elfland really speaks to me of how the fairies themselves may not have any choice over what they do. They too are restrained and they too can be cursed. It's also about a woman desperate to free herself, but she cannot, and she's caught in a cycle of behaviour. But there's also a certain element of injustice in that story because, well, the Queen of Elfland never really does pay for all of those deaths, does she? I'll let you decide whether she should or not. But I certainly think it's an interesting and complex story, and very, very typical of Icelandic tales. So thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time. Toodle pip.